Thank you to our tech experts. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for making the time out of your busy schedules during this week. There's obviously a lot going on, so we really appreciate you joining us. I'm Erwin Loy from the New Humanitarian. This is Jeremy Konyndyk from Refugees International. We're just going to say a few short words of thanks. This is a session on navigating the limits and the evolving role of humanitarian action. I'd like to thank Refugees International for co-organizing this with us, the Center for Transformational Change, and colleagues who have helped make this all happen, including many in the room and many you don't see who are online and helping all that stuff work and organizing behind the scenes. On behalf of the New Humanitarian, I'd also like to thank the Robert Bosch Stiftung. Their support helped make our end of today possible, including helping to bring some of the voices you're about to hear on the panel. At the New Humanitarian, we cover conflict and crises. Our goal is to try and improve the understanding of how aid works and sometimes how it doesn't work, and improve the understanding of people who live in crises. Increasingly, that means questioning why aid fails. It means asking if there's a better way to do it. And I hope we'll hear some of those fresh perspectives on today's panel. Gaza and Sudan are urgent examples. So that's why I'm really looking forward to today's panelists, and hopefully they'll challenge our assumptions about humanitarian aid, its limits, and its future. Thanks.
Thanks, Erwin. I'm Jeremy Konyndyk. I'm the president of Refugees International. We're so thrilled that all of you have turned out, both here in the room and so many joining us virtually on Zoom for this event. I think it is really, it's encouraging and inspiring to see how much engagement and how much interest there is in the topics we're going to discuss today around the limits of humanitarian action in the face of the kind of political failures that we're seeing, and the need to shift power and kind of re-examine power dynamics in the humanitarian sector. And those are both issues that are very close to our hearts here at Refugees International. Really grateful for the partnership with New Humanitarian and Center for Transformational Change on pulling this event together today. And yeah, I don't want to stand in the way of the panel, so thank you all for coming, and we look forward to a great discussion.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'll introduce Eric Reedy, who's the Migration and Special Coverage Editor at the New Humanitarian.
Thank you, Erwin. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, everyone who is attending in person and online today. We have a really excellent panel here with incredibly deep and also personal insight into the topics that we'll be discussing. It's difficult to overstate the extent to which this moment is really one of profound hopelessness and pain for many people. Looking at the world through the lens of what has been allowed to happen or enabled to happen in Sudan for the past year and a half, and in Gaza for the past year, is a dark prism. It's hard to come away with a conclusion other than the fact that the systems the international community has designed since the end of World War II to try to prevent atrocities and mitigate the worst effects of conflict on civilians have utterly failed. I invite the panelists to push back on that if you see things differently, and would very much welcome a less pessimistic conclusion if one is to be found. Barring that, what is our purpose here today? Sudan in many ways suffers from a lack of attention and an absence of care in the global community. Gaza from a torrent of state-propagated disinformation that has succeeded at least in muddying the waters when it comes to the causes of human suffering and the steps that could be taken immediately to address it, if there was the political will to do so. In the face of that, our purpose, in short, is to be honest about what is being done to the people of Sudan and Palestine, to be honest about what we are witnessing, and to be honest about the causes of the failure that we are seeing. Prescribing how to fix it wholesale would be an unrealistic goal for this one discussion, but being honest is a good first step. That and discussing what actions we can push for within the limits of the current system and how we might need to expand our existing definition of humanitarianism and modes of humanitarian action to hopefully achieve better results, or really any results at all, for the people of Sudan and Palestine. That is what we're aiming to do with this discussion. The alternative really would be giving into cynicism and despair, which would amount to an act of abandonment and is a privilege that many cannot afford, particularly in Sudan and Palestine. I am very pleased to be joined in this discussion by Haneen Ahmed, emergency response room volunteer and Sudanese activist, Alex DeWall, executive director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University and one of the foremost global experts on Sudan and famine, Thaher Ahmed, Palestinian American emergency medicine physician and board member of humanitarian aid organization Med Global, Arwa Damon, ex-CNN senior correspondent and president and founder of INARA, and Jeremy Konendijk, who we have already met today, president of Refugees International, humanitarian advocate, and seasoned emergency operator who has served in senior appointments in 2 U.S. administrations and in a range of U.S. and overseas NGO leadership positions. Thank you all for joining us today. To start the panel, I would like to sort of ground our discussion in the reality of what is happening on the ground in both Sudan and Gaza. And we're very fortunate to be joined here today by people who are able to speak directly to what is happening. So Haneen, I would like to start with you. Can you just give us a sense of what the humanitarian situation is like on the ground in Sudan currently? What is daily life like for people who are there?
Morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the new Humanitarian to make our voice heard. I'm today very proud to represent and making my people's voice heard by me. So the situation in the ground is horrible. I'm going to give you in numbers and explain the critical situation. In numbers, the war reached 10 states out of 18 states and count 10,000 people killed, over 10 million people displaced, over 25 million needs aid with 7 million threat of famine, over 9 million children need schooling. So critical situations is spreading pockets of famine with a continual lack of adequate safe humanitarian access, is spreading war with increased displacement and insecurity in Al-Fashir, Sennar, and other states. There is a complete siege in Sennar and in White Nile state by RSF. So there is a lack of humanitarian access and humanitarian aid access. Even for women, there is RSF preventing us for delivering dignity kits or any kind of maternal aid for saving women from maternal health side effects. Looting, air bombing, shelling, arresting, systematic rape, hate speech, child recruitment, and ethnic cleaning, complete collapse for health education system with a vital wash and electronic issues, lack of safe traditional humanitarian access, internet outage, caused high communication cost, which is vital online for banking access. This situation of the ground, it's getting worse every day and every single moment. We are trying to filling the gap, but the gap is too big. Thank you.
Thank you, Haneen. Arwa, I want to come to you next. You were in Gaza in August. Could you just give us a sense of what it was like when you were there? And you've also been multiple times since October last year. So maybe a sense of how the situation has evolved over your visits.
Yeah, I mean, you think that you've seen the worst of it, and then you go back over and over again, and you realize that no matter what it is that your mind tries to imagine worse becoming, it actually is not equivalent to what is happening on the ground. Gaza looks like the aftermath of some sort of crazy apocalyptic time frame, except unlike Hollywood, where after the apocalypse, you would be seeing, zombie-like creatures moving around. This is Gaza's population that is trying to survive on top of, in the rubble, trying to access anything from, a bar of soap, which is inaccessible right now. The situation is so dire that we as humanitarian organizations cannot even provide the population with a bar of soap. And as a result, you have all sorts of communicable diseases that are not only spreading, but also actually killing people. The Al Nasser Hospital, according to the head of the pediatric department, has 2 children per week that are dying from hepatitis A. And that's not even getting into what is happening to all of those who need urgent medical care because of the bombing that is continuing. There is open sewage that's running in the streets. There is hunger. There is a complete and total inability to even get respites. When we talk about the killing of Gazans, we're not just talking about killing due to bombs. We're talking about killing due to disease, and we're talking about killing them psychologically. I have never in 20 years of covering war and working in war zones seen a population who has been under such extreme psychological pressure that when you make eye contact with somebody, that spark of life we all have in our eye is completely and totally gone. And it's gone because it's the only way that they can survive. It's gone because a mother who has seen her daughter's head blown off in front of her tells you about that incident in a complete and total monotone tone of voice, because if she allows her emotion to break through, she will crack. And if she cracks, she will break. And if she breaks, her other surviving children are not going to be able to make it through.
Thank you, Arwa. Tahir, I want to come to you next. You were in Gaza earlier this year as well. You've also been to Gaza multiple times during previous rounds of war as well. Could you give us a sense of what you saw when you were there, and also maybe how it compared to previous visits you've made?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was unrecognizable from before. I mean, I think one of the challenges was having to see what it looked like before October 7th, and then being confronted with this area that's been totally leveled. I remember that I was at Nasser Hospital, actually, and being there and seeing over 10,000 people displaced in and around the hospital, and hearing where they were coming from. I had been to the areas where they had come from north of Gaza, from Gaza City, from Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and just hearing about what had happened to these places, and then some of the images that are emerging, and then realizing that many of these folks who had decided to flee south because they were told that's where it would be safe, not only had the war arrived to the south, but they were starting to come to grips with the reality that they would never be able to return north. And I think the struggle has been that every single incident that we're hearing about, whether it was the flower massacre where there are hundreds of hungry Palestinians trying to get a bag of flour instead being fired on by tanks, or the 3-hour operator call with Hind Rajab, where you have to hear a 6-year-old for 3 hours, her life slowly fading away as no emergency response person can come and reach her. Or even most recently last week, when there was a family whose home had been destroyed, and you hear a young child trying to extend their hand through the rubble, and the civil defense or the first responders using his hands to try to save her. And then you slowly hear her breaths become more agonizing and painful until you don't hear her breaths anymore. And my concern is this 360-degree assault on life. It keeps getting compounded every single month. When Arwa says there's been no reprieve, I mean, that's just making the conditions on the ground that much more difficult, and they're all on top of each other. These incidents are not isolated, and every single one of them compound in a way that's really devastating, whether it's the hunger, whether it's the outbreak of polio, the communicable diseases that we're talking about with hepatitis A, the lack of aid entry. These things all work together to devastate life in Gaza. And I think that's kind of what's most concerning for me, because every single time I think about being at Nasser Hospital, the second largest hospital in Gaza, at the time, the largest functioning one, I think about my last days there. And it's the Israeli military showed up and did to that hospital what they've done to every other hospital. And again, there was some bogus pretext, but now that major hospital was rendered defunct, and now it's starting its operations back up again, but it's not going to be the same as it was before it was attacked and raided. Instead, the hospital is trying to function, and there's a mass grave in its perimeter, and all of the people, the displaced people that were initially there, who knows what's happened to them and where they went. And I think that's probably what's lost in some of the headlines, is how all of these things have worked against the people for the last 11 months and made the situation that much more devastating.
Thank you. Alex, I want to come to you now. A common feature of what is happening in both Sudan and Gaza is the food insecurity crisis in both places. What are the causes of food insecurity in both contexts?
So thank you, and it's very hard to follow and comment after hearing these, very intimate and traumatic stories. But let me step back. Let me give the view from 30,000 feet and how we understand famines, food emergencies, mass starvation. And there are three basic approaches. There's the approach of famine scales. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, which you can classify these according to magnitude, the numbers who are dying, intensity or severity, how bad it is in a location, and the duration. A second approach is to look at famine as a societal catastrophe, about the struggle to have a dignified livelihood and even to retain those basic human values. I mean, the fundamentals of famine, the experience of famine as experiencing degradation, dehumanization, to the point at which people are more like animals than human beings. And then the third approach is the famine crimes approach. The purposes of starvation, the political priorities and intents of those who are inflicting it. So if we position first Sudan and then Gaza within this framework, what we see is Sudan is the largest by magnitude. The numbers affected, the numbers who are likely to die, is the largest by magnitude for 40 years, if not longer. It's had a long descent, long and complicated descent, with pockets of extreme intensity. It is societal collapse, with some of those who are perpetrating this benefiting from it. Militarily, also economically. They're actually conniving. They're actually, throughout this period, their commercial traffic is going across the front lines and people are profiting. And each side is using starvation differently. The RSF is a sort of pillage machine, and while the so-called government is blocking humanitarian access. Each side is using starvation as a means to political goals, and each is ready to make trade-offs under pressure. But the pressure is not being put on them to make those trade-offs. Gaza is very different, actually, in its metrics. It's not the biggest because the numbers actually are not, by definition, cannot exceed more than about 2 million. But it is the most intense, the most severe, it is the most rapid descent. So the metrics were designed for places like Somalia, South Sudan, where you already had a burden of disease and malnutrition, which were not there in Gaza a year ago. So in order to meet those thresholds, in order to turn the map red, as it were, the level of descent for the population of Gaza had to be 3 times greater than it would have been in Somalia or South Sudan. It is a societal catastrophe. I mean, it is the experience of dehumanization. And Israel knows this. If you look at the way the compassion, the sense of dignity, the technical care that Israel extended to the survivors of starvation, the released hostages who came back, and you read the accounts of how those Israeli medical professionals treated those individuals, they know. So Israel is, in my view, using famine not as a trade-off, but as a means. And in fact, famine in the sense of that societal destruction is very probably the actual intent that of the operation that Israel is undertaking. If we look at this in a historical perspective, the government of Israel finds itself in the company of some extremely unsavory characters over the last 100 years.
Thank you, Alex. Jeremy, I want to turn to you to focus in on that a little bit more, and particularly on how the politicization or the weaponization of aid in both Sudan and Gaza have contributed to the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I would go back even further. I think, this kind of practice of impeding humanitarian access, of obstructing humanitarian aid, of using that obstruction of aid in intentional combination with inflicting suffering on a population, it didn't start in Sudan and Gaza, or you might say it started in Sudan, but generations ago in previous iterations of conflict in Sudan. But what I think has changed, particularly since the war in Syria, is there is a level of growing level of great power acceptance of that is really new and terrifying, frankly. Every major war in these days now seems to be fought by Syria rules, meaning there is utter impunity for violations of international humanitarian law. There is utter impunity for attacks on protected objects under IHL, utter impunity for attacks on medical facilities, on schools, on aid organizations and aid personnel. The world got, rightly, extremely angry after 7 World Central Kitchen staff members were killed. Of course, they are only 7 of hundreds who have been killed in Gaza. Most of whom did not result in a call from the president to the head of the president of the United States to the head of their organizations. I don't know that the president has ever expressed condolences to Philippe Lazzarini for all the staff that UNRWA has lost. So, there is a kind of degradation that we saw in Syria that was not punished in Syria, that was allowed to proceed. And other countries, other fighting forces are realizing now they can get away with this. And so they are getting away with it. It was an issue with the Saudi and Emirati coalition in Yemen. It is an issue with Russia and Ukraine. Of course, Russia had a hand in it in Syria as well. It's, as Alex and Arwa and Dr. Thayer have described, it's a huge problem in Gaza. And we're seeing it again in Sudan, both, from both sides. And the core idea of international humanitarian law is that the obligations of international humanitarian law are not reciprocal. They are upon each actor. And so, when we speak out on this, we will sometimes get pushback. And I've had these debates with directly with representatives of the Israeli government, with members of the US government who say, well, but September 11 was horrible. Hamas is a terrorist organization. What do you expect them to do? October 7th. October 7th was horrible. Hamas is a terrorist organization. But that does not justify reciprocating tactics, right? And when, as the Israeli government sometimes does, as now recently the government of the United Arab Emirates is doing, if you justify your own violations based on the other side's violations, that is not the logic of international humanitarian law, and frankly, that's not ethics. And so what we do need is political leaders who are willing to uphold that. We must hold ourselves to a higher standard than that. The lesson, one of the key lessons of World War II, this generation that left us with the Geneva Conventions as a legacy of that war. The Geneva Conventions do not enshrine how that war was fought. They enshrine the principle that we should never fight a war that way again. And what we are losing when we lose that is, I think, of historical importance. So we do need to see accountability. We need to see governments that are willing to apply international humanitarian law, not based only on geopolitical alliances. I mean, this is, I'll close on this point. For years, cynics and, particularly Vladimir Putin have argued that all of these kind of Western defenses of international humanitarian law are basically bullshit. It's just geopolitics. It's just a cudgel. And I think for a long time, you could argue against that. And I think even back to when I was serving the Obama administration and the work that we did on Yemen, it was deeply imperfect. I was never satisfied with where we got to, but we did hold the line with the Saudis on the impediment of humanitarian aid. We negotiated and worked with the UN to break the Saudi blockade. That was one area where the US did try to uphold that and tried to uphold the principle from Syria as well, that a belligerent should not be able to veto aid going into its territory or into the territory in which it's fighting. And so the UN in both places set up an independent inspection mechanism. The US supported the opposite view with respect to Gaza. And it's going to be very hard in the future to ever defend that kind of thing again for another, for the next generation. So when we lose that consistent upholding of some level of humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law, it is not just a concession to that conflict. It is basically validating the cynic's view that IHL ultimately is just window dressing and just an extension of geopolitics. And that is a deeply frightening place to be when you look at the broader sweep of history and why we have IHL in the first place.
I want to ask a quick follow-up on that as well. Basically, every humanitarian aid organization that I've spoken to has said that when it comes to Gaza, the countries that those organizations typically rely on to be their humanitarian diplomatic advocates have been absolutely unwilling to perform that role. Do you have any insight into that from your position?
I think that's accurate. We see an irony now that, again, the voices that are trying to uphold IHL and uphold humanitarian access are doing so now not based on those principles or based on some even-handedness. They're doing so based on geopolitics. So, the US has very loudly argued against Russia's strikes on humanitarians and Russia's collective punishment tactics in Ukraine on the basis that that is a clear war crime. And it is a clear war crime. And at the same time, when very similar tactics are being used by the Israeli government with respect to Gaza, the US runs interference endlessly here in New York, has used its veto and threatened its veto multiple times. And the United Arab Emirates, which has been one of the leading voices here on humanitarian access in Gaza and trying to push resolutions through the Security Council with respect to that, is, and has for the past year, according to New York Times and the UN panel of experts, been shipping arms to the rapid support forces in Darfur who are committing acts of genocide. So it is very difficult to see any of that as anything but geopolitics. And that really, as a long-time humanitarian, that I find that heartbreaking, because we need to have more than just geopolitical advantage underpinning international humanitarian law, or otherwise this impunity that has been accelerating since the war in Syria will just be the new international norm, and that is functionally the collapse of IHL.
Alex, thinking about Sudan specifically, how has decisions made by the UN and sort of the way that the UN and UN agencies are approaching the aid response contributed to what we're seeing in terms of the hunger crisis?
I think the UN has been pretty spineless. I think one of the errors made by the UN just over a year ago was to extend recognition to the Sudan Armed Forces as the sovereign government of Sudan at a time actually when the African Union was not recognizing Sudan. It had suspended Sudan. There's this odd thing where if you talk to the senior officials at the UN, they defer to the African Union. They say this is an African problem. The African Union must handle it, knowing perfectly well that actually it's not an African problem. it is in large part a problem created by Sudan's position vis-a-vis the other shore of the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, and others also being involved. So the Africans can't solve it. And yet, on that key issue, they don't defer to the African Union. They recognize the General Burhan as the legitimate leader of a sovereign state, thereby handing him the veto over aid access. And you have this absurd situation on the border with Chad, whereby the border is completely open. Arms smugglers cross it every day. And there's no presence of the Sudanese army within hundreds of miles. And yet the World Food Programme keeps its aid trucks on the Chadian side because it doesn't get that piece of paper from the authorities in Port Sudan. I think this is a classic example where the UN should be leading a multilateral effort to seek a political consensus position in response to what is the collapse of a country with international peace and security implications, and it is simply failing to do that.
Haneen, I want to turn to you and get your perspective on what the barriers are that exist to a more robust aid response taking shape in Sudan.
Okay, I want to comment also on the UN system in Sudan. There is a complete absence for the international community, especially in the hot areas controlled by RSF. So ERR's volunteers are filling gaps for visas, processing, for saving life for the international community, saving money and time at the same time. So we innovate something called LCC, which is the Localization Coordination Council. This Localization Coordination Council includes emergency response rooms from different states, 9 states of Sudan, including 5 Darfurian states, and include also the local NGOs, which is the mechanism. We have different mechanisms for funding to fill the gap for the UN. We recently have funded project by WFP, which is first time in WFP to fund the soup kitchen because it's hard, as Prof. Alex, to get the trucks in. The challenges that we face, we have a lot of challenges from the health situation. Right now, our volunteers on the ground facing unknown kind of fever, and there is a lack of medical supplies on the ground, especially, as I said, in the areas controlled by RSF, because RSF prevented us to let the aid in, and also if we let it in, they steal it. So this is one of the challenges. We also have a financial challenges. We don't have enough money due to inflation ongoing on the ground. We have security challenges. Both of the sides accuse us as intelligence for each other. So they arrested our colleagues. So that's why we stay neutrally. We don't favor any side. We don't involve ourselves in any political discussion. We have societal challenges because the war changed the demography of the society. So we are trying to sue the community fabric, but it's also too hard. 2 days ago, I lost one of my dearest friends and our volunteers on the ground due to side effect of the unknown fever, and unfortunately, we can't save his life. And every day we lost our volunteer and we couldn't save their life. This is one of our biggest challenges because they are the soul of the body and we can't do anything and no one can help us and no one can recognize this. We just keep saying and talking on the panels, but no one cares exactly about what's going on the ground for the volunteers.
Thank you, Haneen. Arwa, I want to come back to you also for a perspective from Gaza about what sort of practically it is like trying to get aid across the border and also distributing it inside Gaza once it's there.
Yeah, and before I address that, Haneen and I have known each other for a few weeks right now. And I have to say, like, if we're going to have this conversation about humanitarian action moving forward, what the Sudanese have accomplished in terms of this emergency response community and network that they have built should really be looked at by larger organizations and governments that want to respond to crisis as potentially one of the models to try to emulate elsewhere. Because one of the big problems that you do see when you're out there in the space is, aid tends to be top down, whereas it has to be bottom up. And there is such extraordinary capacity on the ground in a lot of these places, and that goes for Gaza as well. In theory, hypothetically speaking, there is absolutely no reason to have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to delivering assistance in Gaza. There are extraordinary individuals there. There are teachers who are setting up makeshift educational tents. There are doctors who are setting up field clinics. There are people who are rallying together within their own communities and their networks, trying to deliver hot meals, trying to deliver baby powder, trying to deliver diapers, trying to deliver everything. The infrastructure is there, and this is what is so difficult to wrap your head around, but the aid is not getting into Gaza. And one of the big problems with why aid isn't getting into Gaza is not just that Israel is excruciatingly slow and very unclear in terms of what is allowed to get in and what isn't, and it's constantly changing the goalposts, but also because what you see happening in Gaza right now is what I call deliberately orchestrated anarchy. There are chunks of Gaza, of the roads that Israel designates for us to use, that we cannot safely cross to go pick up aid. There's looting, there's criminal gangs, there's, deconfliction that isn't properly functioning. And so what we keep asking for is either give us a safe route or secure the route. And we do know, by the way, that the Israelis can secure the route, because when I was convoying out of Gaza 3 weeks ago, they were buzzing a quadcopter overhead and there was not a single looter or any sort of, guy running around with a machete. Or give us alternative routes. It would boggle your mind. I mean, and look, I have a journalism background, right? Like, I am built and I have spent 20 years figuring out how to find back doors and different ways to sort of do mental gymnastics to get from point A to point B. I cannot do mental gymnastics sufficiently enough to figure out how to get a bar of soap into Gaza, because that's the level of blockades that we are consistently up against. Add to that, the rubble that's everywhere, the roads that you can't cross through properly because, they've been churned up and chewed up and spat back out. Add to that, the traffic jam, the clog of people that is in this tiny little space. It took us, I think on one day, we wanted to try to get, 4 tents to families in Khan Yunis. A road that should have taken 15 minutes took us 6 hours. And so it's constant and consistent. And the thing is these solutions are actually there, but the global political will to push them through is not.
Tara, I know you have been trying to go back to Gaza to volunteer again. And I think we spoke before the panel, and the reasons why you haven't been able to do that, I think, are sort of revealing in themselves about the response. And I was wondering if you would be willing to share them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think it's a part of a broader theme in terms of just trying to make access difficult, restricting aid, and using that as a way to apply pressure by the Israeli military. But, I think what we've heard in the communications that we've been receiving is that anybody that wants to access Gaza, first of all, will need to spend at least 4 weeks there, which, for our subspecialists, a plastic surgeon, a burn surgeon, a trauma surgeon, that's virtually impossible for them to be able to get away from their practice that long and be able to serve the population. And then the other thing that we heard is that nobody with Palestinian heritage will be allowed into Gaza. And these are in these official communications that we're seeing as a part of all the volunteer threads under the emergency medical teams. So much so that even it went to the extent of clarifying that you don't have to have a Palestinian ID card or a Palestinian citizenship or born in Palestine. Even if your grandparents are Palestinian, you'll be prohibited from entering. And in fact, CNN talked about Dr. Ali, and I can't remember his last name, a surgeon from Texas. He went and he tried to get in. And I think all of this has been really heightened after May 6th, when the Israeli military stormed the border between Egypt and Palestine, Egypt and Gaza. And suddenly the new route for many of these humanitarian organizations that are sending in medical teams has to be through going to Jordan, from Jordan to Israel, from Israel to Gaza. So now, instead of sort of the Israelis calling the shots through their Egyptian counterparts, they're on the ground actually. And we found it incredibly difficult to bring in any sort of supplies. In fact, last week, September 17th, a convoy of medical professionals were going in and smartphones were confiscated, anesthetics were confiscated, teams were turned back. In fact, one person who was trying to bring in passports for medical evacuation was turned away. The passports were confiscated, and that person is potentially facing lifetime ban from Israel. So there's aid restrictions. There's the prevention of people being able to get out, especially people who need urgent medical evacuation. Ever since May 6th, this has been an incredibly difficult process. And we're not just talking about trauma victims. We're talking about kids who've been diagnosed with cancer who need chemotherapy. We're talking about people who need life-saving surgery. All of that has come to a screeching halt, and there's periodically small amounts of people who a few days where people are allowed to somehow evacuate, no formal process. And there's been this sort of, it gets into the nuance of preventing Palestinians from accessing that area. And I have to reconcile with the fact that I've been to Gaza over the last 15 years, more times than I can count. And this idea even of, I'm never going to be able to go to Gaza again. I'll never be able to see my Palestinian brethren in Gaza. Why? Because there's an arbitrary decision now that for some reason Palestinian doctors who speak the language, know the culture, who know where people, who when people say, oh, I was displaced to Gaza in 1948, I know what city they're talking about, so maybe I shouldn't be allowed to enter into Gaza. And that's something that I find personally very frustrating, but I'm just very worried about these sort of restrictions being applied.
I think Arwa was very correct in pointing out that the emergency response rooms are one of the few bright spots when it comes to what is happening in Sudan. And I was hoping that you'd be able to tell us a little bit more just about how they formed and what role they're playing on the ground and what they're able to do given all of the limitations that exist.
Emergency response room. The emergency response rooms, we are the first responders, a grassroots body, including resistance committee, which is a revolutionary body, kicked Bashir out. We have technician professionals, different community leaders and members. So we are a huge body, including different categories from our society. That's how we are sewing the society fabric. We are a grassroots, so we are serving us for us. We are delivering the services for our community. We are agile, we are stay innovative, and immediately respond to the need coming from the ground. We are recognized. We are recognized by OSHA, USAID, and other international community. We are aim to provide a mutual aid through economy and solidarity. Emergency response room provide different, and also we have principles, which is transparency, participation, equality, and accountability. So we have a structured body. This body includes a representative, which is a legislative part of the emergency response room, and we have internal constitution. We have also the working group. As a working group, we have financial committee, we have program committee, we have reporting committee, and we have external comms, which I am from. And we have the specialized offices like women response rooms. we have, which is Women Response Room, providing gender-based violence and women empowerment activities and different activities related to women. We have Food and Security Office, which is delivering soup kitchens. We have like 600 soup kitchens around Sudan. We have database, we have 10,000 volunteer emergency. I'm so proud to tell that the emergency response room is founded by a few people in Khartoum, including myself. And right now this body is leading 10,000 volunteers around Sudan, delivering aid for Sudanese civilian in complete absence for the international community and Sudanese government on the ground. We also have protection office related to evacuation and other protection. We have different mechanism on the ground. We have health office, which is try to dealing with unknown diseases and this catastrophic health situation on the ground. What else? I also said the challenges. So yeah, we innovated the LCC that I mentioned before. This LCC also includes the international community actors. So we have this mechanism. We have different organizations. I'm going to mention some of them. We have UNICEF, we have CORE, we have DRC, IRC, NRC. We are in coordination with Proximity International. So we also, and also Sudan Humanitarian Fund. We have different ways of mechanisms for funding. It depends on the donor who want to share the risk with us directly. They localize the fund to the emergency response room, like CORE and NRC. Some of them funded local organization, and then the local organizations deliver the fund for us. And some of them funded SHF and Proximity, and also they deliver the fund directly for us.
Thank you. Coming back to you, in terms of thinking about Gaza, do you think the language of referring to what is happening as a humanitarian crisis in some ways actually obscures what is taking place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a lot of semantics that have been used in a way to really not be able to illustrate really what's happening and the catastrophe that's ongoing. I mean, framing it in a context, oh, this is a humanitarian crisis, there are people who are hungry, and not sort of talking about the etiology of any of these things and recognizing how it took place. I think that's been a concern because first, for somebody who's been there before, it almost ignores how these conditions were sort of implemented. Before October 7th, there was still a blockade on Gaza. And it's a blockade that's been there for almost 2 decades. And how that's contributed to what we've seen is something that I think is of concern here. I think before October 7th, it was really hard if you were a Palestinian in Gaza to get out of Gaza. And was that a humanitarian crisis just that arose because of the landscape or the geography? I mean, what are the forces at play here? And there has been a real aversion to sort of calling out different things with respect to what's happened in this conflict. I think about when the World Central Kitchen convoy was struck, and then a few weeks later, I believe 6 different humanitarian organizations released a statement. Project Hope, ANERA, World Central Kitchen, Doctors Without Borders, IRC, and Medical Aid for Palestine. And all 6 of the organizations who are on the ground, who are reputable organizations, were saying that we have been targeted and attacked. So this is not just a humanitarian crisis where NGOs are on the ground responding. Even these NGOs that are trying to do the work, the same forces that contributed to the humanitarian crisis are even attacking these organizations. When you have 1,000 healthcare workers that have been killed, over 160 UN workers, over 125 journalists, when you talk about all of the academics that have been killed, they weren't killed by the humanitarian crisis. So I think it's important to at least recognize and be honest. We have to have that conversation. And I think that's part of the reason why we're at where we're at. You talked about in the beginning, muddying the waters. Well, how do you do that? You do that by sort of referring to it as like, oh, there's a drought in Gaza or something, or the conditions in Gaza are horrible. Well, why are the conditions there? I mean, if you're not going to address the source of the problem, then we're just going to continue to keep talking about the symptoms. And I think that's really contributed to what we're seeing now.
Alex, do you think something similar could be said for Sudan when it comes to the language of humanitarian crisis, sort of obscuring what's happening in some ways?
I think it's a generic problem that we have had over the decades of seeing starvation as something that just happens, rather than recognizing the verb to starve refers usually to when one person is starving another person, and that becomes particularly acute in both these crises currently. But I just want to add one other point, which is that polio. So what we saw, earlier this month was the ability, when Israel felt that it was in its interests, it had a priority of stopping polio because its own population would be at risk. It could run and facilitate, I should say, a very effective polio vaccination program. If Israel wanted every child in Gaza to have breakfast tomorrow morning, it would do it. And I think we just have to ask, why is it not doing it?
Yeah. Jeremy, there's sort of a narrative that is pitting Sudan against Gaza in terms of Gaza receiving a lot of media attention, Sudan receiving a lot less media attention. I think there's sort of, there's a lot to get into in terms of why that narrative exists, which I don't think is the what we're talking about on this panel right now. But do you think that if Sudan was receiving more media attention, it would help? And why has there been such negligence from international donors in terms of directing funding towards the crisis?
Yeah, early in my career, and when I first kind of began getting involved after working overseas in humanitarian operations, when I first began getting involved in humanitarian advocacy, it was around 2008, 2009, which was sort of the peak then of the Save Darfur movement and all of that. And, there was just a palpably different level of energy, kind of public energy and political engagement around Sudan and the war in Sudan as an acute problem that needed to be addressed. Now, the way that was addressed, again, deeply imperfect. UNAMID was deeply imperfect, but I would much rather have UNAMID in Darfur today than not, as imperfect as it was. And I think that the lack of public attention on what is happening in Sudan, it really does reverberate certainly in U.S. politics and in global politics. And I think that the global attention and activism and focus on Gaza is entirely appropriate and well-placed. But I would really hope that we could see some of that mirrored for Sudan as well. Because, as Alex said earlier, on a basis of absolute scale, Sudan looks primed to be the largest famine perhaps ever. One of the things that's always challenging with advocacy is it's always easier to get people spun up when you can kind of focus on one side. There are no good guys in Sudan's war, right? The RSF are terrible. They are committing mass atrocities on the daily in Darfur. The Sudanese armed forces are also terrible. The RSF is just an offshoot of the Sudanese armed forces. They were allies until they weren't. So, neither of these sides are admirable. Both of them are committing war crimes routinely. Both of them are inflicting suffering on the population. So, that is just a harder advocacy message as a structural message to say, there are no good guys here. Please get involved. That just does not, unfortunately, land as well. But nonetheless, I think it is really crucial that we make, as a community, more noise about this, that we one thing, and I have deeply mixed feelings about the Kony 2012 campaign. Those of you who remember that, it was really, I'll just say deeply mixed feelings. I didn't like that advocacy approach. But what was fascinating to me was what happened in Washington politics when members of Congress started getting phone calls to their offices from 14-year-olds who had never really paid any attention to this stuff before. It suddenly turned it into a salient political issue for them. And it spurred a level of engagement and energy. And so I think there is, and we at Refugees International have been trying to generate more activism around Sudan. We've been working with people like Haneen and people in the Sudanese diaspora here in the US to focus more attention. One of the things that we are doing right now is calling on the NBA and the Boston Celtics and the Denver Nuggets to cancel a couple of preseason games that are scheduled in Abu Dhabi in a few weeks. There is no reason, we know, and again, this is not to single out UAE or to single out the RSF, because as I said, both sides in this war are terrible. But if the UAE cares a great deal about its global image, it invests heavily in its global image. That's why it brings the NBA to Abu Dhabi. It's why it brings artists like Macklemore to play in UAE, and he just canceled his show over Sudan. So I think it is important not to cooperate with image laundering when the UAE has been, again, very credibly found to have been sending arms to the RSF, which does not excuse what the SAF is doing. What the SAF is doing is equally terrible. But no one should be sending arms in, and there is a long-standing arms embargo on Darfur that the UAE itself voted to authorize when it was on the Security Council. So I think we need to call that sort of thing out. We need to create that kind of pressure, and when activism does create that kind of pressure, I think it will bring results.
All right, I have one question for you, and then two questions for sort of everyone, whoever on the panel wants to chime in. I'm also conscious of time and wanting to leave a little bit of time for Q&A for people from the audience and also who are watching online. But Arwa, to what extent does agreeing to work within the parameters that Israel has established and fully controls in Gaza give sort of a false sense of legitimacy to an aid response that is really just sort of the facade of an aid response? And I've spoken to some people who work for humanitarian organizations that are responding on the ground in Gaza, and they have very mixed feelings about whether it might be better to actually just refuse to participate in some ways.
I am a big believer of the reality that people who are already suffering should not be made to suffer more because of any sort of political maneuvering. I do not believe for a second personally that us having to work within certain, let's just be clear that we don't work within certain parameters because there are no parameters in Gaza. There is a suffocating system that has been set up deliberately to ensure that at best, a drop of what the population needs is actually what gets through. And I think all of us have been very clear in terms of talking openly about how hard and how impossible it is to actually be able to get anything done. No one's really out there being like, oh yeah, my organization is able to get all this aid in across the border, and we're doing these mass distributions, and look at how wonderful we are. And I think the big burden of responsibility is on us to speak even more, because here's another thing we also need to remember about Gaza. There are no foreign journalists allowed into Gaza. The entire burden of responsibility on what's happening there is on Gazan journalists and on social media activists who, for the first time in their history, actually have agency over how their story is being reported. The only sort of outsiders who are able to get into Gaza are those who are going in on humanitarian missions. And our ability to go in there on a humanitarian mission and have the firsthand experience and then be able to take that out and talk about it is also an extra sort of layer to, what does it mean to actually mount a humanitarian response? And there's also, two points I'd like to briefly make, and that is that I think what we're seeing right now, if we're just talking Sudan and Gaza, is the way that people are trying to step up and reclaim control over a system that has for far too long been dictated, let's face it, mostly by Western powers. So if we look at, in the journalism space, Gaza, and the way that Gazans themselves have taken control of their narrative and sort of stepped in to fill in that gap, so to speak. If we look at Sudan and the way that the Sudanese community has stepped in where outside forces, the international aid community has failed them. These are things hopefully that are trends that we're going to be able to recognize and actually work towards amplifying as opposed to just talking about. I mean,
it's a fair point. And then the two questions I have for everyone, and I guess if you want to chime in on either of them, please just jump in. But the first one is, what does what we're seeing in both Sudan and Gaza reveal about the limits of humanitarian action, and where does that leave us in terms of what the aid sector can do? And if traditional approaches of humanitarian diplomacy, advocacy, and action are failing to prevent famine and atrocities in Gaza and Sudan, what other tools could be used to try to address the underlying causes of the suffering? So does somebody want to jump in on that first?
Sure. Well, I just want to, I think Jeremy actually alluded to this with the response to like what happened in Syria. I think the concern that I think many people have is when it comes to humanitarian advocacy, you can sort of come back, you're a neutral observer, there's the principles of humanitarianism, impartiality, and you can sort of have this testimony. And then that testimony can be used to sort of develop action or at least, change the situation on the ground. I think one of the things that we've noticed over the last 11 months, especially in Gaza, and definitely the case in Sudan, is there is no accountability. There has been no accountability for these parties that are perpetuating sort of the crimes that we're seeing. And in general, I think that can sort of not persist for very long. But what I'm noticing in Gaza is there is a tremendous amount of censorship. And there's erasure of obviously the Palestinian narrative, and then there's the dehumanization portion of this. So it's really kind of spiraled into this horrifying conversation where you got to be careful with what you're saying, especially from a humanitarian background, because you may have your access revoked to Gaza. You may not be able to do the work. Your staff on the ground, local Palestinians may be targeted and killed. And on top of that, the political will to achieve a solution is not there. And so you coming out while you're sort of playing ball and trying to at least stay within the confines of being a neutral observer, whatever that means, you're not seeing the advocacy portion of it translate into any sort of action. In fact, quite the contrary. And I don't want to bring up weapons, but just in general, a call for an arms embargo or restricting aid or conditioning aid, for example, that many different groups have been calling for, the political will isn't there. And in fact, what we've seen is an acceleration of the procurement of weapons for some of these parties that are involved in these conflicts.
In terms of new tools, I'd look at two things. I think first, and There's just touched on this, the battle over narrative is extraordinarily important in both of these crises. The narrative of who is in the right and who is in the wrong, whether anyone is in the right, frankly. But the narrative over is, as much as international humanitarian law is being violated, I think countries still they don't want to be seen or they don't want to be acknowledged as violating it. And there is a certain power in that. And the narrative battle and shaping that narrative is extremely important. And if you look at if you look at the website of COGAT, the kind of the Israeli government and military authority that administers the Palestinian territories, there is a huge amount of investment in basically countering the official reporting from the UN with which they disagree. I think it shows that there is a sensitivity to narrative, that there is a power in that, and it is, to Arwa's point, it's why it is important to make sure that a fulsome picture of what's actually happening is coming out. The other one that I'd point to, and it is kind of newer to the kind of traditional, if you will, humanitarian toolkit, is legal action. And it has been very striking to see how the ICC and ICJ cases, however those ultimately turn out, and we will not know for many, many, many years, given how long those processes tend to take. But the core content of both of those is fundamental humanitarian. It is about the obstruction of humanitarian aid and kind of that portion of the violation of IHL. And so that is why the kind of reporting that we've been talking about here about the realities of what's happening and the ability to assess intent behind the level of obstruction that Arwa and Thera were describing, that is a legally salient thing. And that is sort of new territory. It's somewhat uncomfortable and unfamiliar territory, I think, for humanitarians. And it's, how that interfaces with traditional approaches of neutrality and impartiality, I think, are potentially pretty challenging. But when the Security Council is failing, great powers are failing, there are not too many other places to go to uphold IHL.
Just very briefly, putting it in a historical context, as my former professor at Oxford, Amartya Sen, would say, India was the land of famine. What overcame famine in India was a free press, democratic elections, and judicial activism. And that is the story at national level. Replicated. What we need to do, I think, is to do that at international level.
For me, on the Prof. Alex comments that the famine, right now we are starting making some kind of agricultural projects in the safe states to fighting famine in Sudan through youth networks, through women networks. So it kind of recycling or replaying the economic wheel and fighting this critical situation on the ground right now. So support, the traditional support, is one of the ways that make this time more easier for the citizens of Sudan and also for Gaza citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think now we will open it up to a couple of, I think we probably have like 5 minutes for question, five or 10 minutes for question and answer. So we don't go too far over, but yeah.
All right, I'm going to be doing one in the room, one on Zoom. We'll see how many we get through. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this really crucial conversation. I'm Aditi Sangal. I'm from CNN. And I kind of want to ask about the undoing of two institutions Jeremy has already referred to, or undermining in the ICJ's case. And Arwa mentioned, not reinventing the wheel because the things are already there, UNRWA. So if you could comment on the undoing, the undermining of these institutions and what the future looks like in that context.
I'm assuming you're specifically talking about Gaza.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very carefully calculated strategy of war to try to undermine the work of the largest organization that has historically been providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian community, both within Palestinian territories and overseas. And I think actually the media has a huge burden of responsibility in terms of how it presents, digests, and then repeats and fails to question certain elements of information that it is receiving purely from the Israeli government side. I do believe that as a former senior correspondent for CNN, and as a big believer in the power that the media can have, we need to be very, very careful of how we're being played. We know exactly what that looked like post 9/11, and we're seeing it happening again right now.
And if I can just add about UNRWA specifically, this is an incredible institution for Palestinians. One of the largest employees, the second largest medical provider, education system, even delivery of aid. Actually, Arwa mentioned the infrastructure is there in terms of delivering aid. UNRWA can do that. And so instead of being able to make sure that this is an organization that can reach the most vulnerable populations in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, instead for fiscal year 2025, its largest funder, the United States, is not going to be funding it. Where's that funding going to come from? Every other nation has resumed funding except for the United States, but that's the biggest chunk. And so in addition to so many of their workers being killed, over 160 of them, we're also making sure that this institution can't survive this conflict right now.
I think Arwa's point about the narratives that are being created around UNRWA is incredibly important. When you look back at the allegations that were made that kind of kicked off the wave of suspensions of funding, there was a clear media strategy around those that was far greater than the substance of the allegations. And that was treated very credulously by the US government. It was treated very credulously then by other governments because they figured the US government must have had something. I mean, and I've talked with governments about this who said, well, we assumed the US knew something, and so we suspended too. As it's become clear that that was not the case, every other government except for the US has resumed funding to UNRWA. But I think, when you look back at how those allegations were made and the immediate kind of flooding of the zone in the media to lend credibility, or the appearance, the patina of credibility to those allegations, it created a political pressure that was far out of proportion to the substance and the actual evidence available. When that was provided to Lazzarini, it was just the headline. There was no evidence provided. The US government subsequently sought the evidence and has not received it from the Israeli government, but hasn't resumed funding. And I think what it shows is that's really not about the underlying evidence. It is about the successful creation of a sort of panic in the media.
I think we probably have time for like one more question, one online question, one in-person question. Let's ask them both at the same time, and then we can let people address them collectively.
Hi, Serena Tomei. I first want to say thank you very much for being here and for speaking on this very important topic. For Haneen and Thad, it's so difficult for you to be here to continue to raise awareness for what's happening to your people, despite the immeasurable loss that you've experienced. So thank you. It takes a lot of bravery and courage. My question is about the media as well. And I just want to paint the picture of what it's like to be an Arab living in the United States. This is a situation that is always the case, but of course was amplified after October 7th, where we have news channels and we see the news of what's happening on the ground in Palestine. We have in connection with our friends and family. And we see things like Lebanese and Palestinian journalists being killed in airstrikes live on air. And then we see the American media parroting the propaganda of the Israeli government that is most often baseless and was later found out to be lies. And it's gaslighting at the highest level. And it's very difficult for us to comprehend, how this leads to a dehumanization of Arab people, but also manufactured consent for what's happening in Gaza. So all of you know this, I'm not saying anything that is new, but my question is, what can we do to push for further accountability from our media? And Arwa, I'm looking at you mostly for your background, but I invite the whole panel to answer this question. And recent news, of course, coming out from the own US media is ProPublica released the USAID report that Blinken lied to Congress about obstructions of Israeli aid into Gaza. And this is also manufactured consent for us here in the United States as well, of the information that we are told about our own government and their complicity. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Let's take one more question so we can answer them sort of in concert.
Okay, so an online question we have, an anonymous one. So can the UN and major organizations through the cluster system move from a formal and neutral coordination system to instead a tool of political pressure on all parties to conflicts, and in so, advocate for humanitarian access? In short, doesn't the politicization of aid imposed by parties to conflicts merit an overt politicization of negotiations for access by the humanitarian sector writ large? A big question I can repeat if necessary.
Yeah, so whoever wants to jump in on either or both of those.
I'll just do the question. Listen, it's I was at CNN for 17 years. It's a constant struggle, to try to get sort of, we call it the human story. And don't get me wrong, there are some extraordinary journalists out there who are doing phenomenal work at telling the human story. But what you're up against is these forces that exist that are trying to dehumanize, right? No country, no nation, no entity can go to war and garner support without somehow dehumanizing the enemy. And we, or rather the media, but even the consumers of the media need to be increasingly more aware of what these very specific dehumanization tactics are. We need to be very highly cognizant of what rhetoric not to keep on repeating, and also where our information is continuously coming from. And this is, something that, the role that social media is playing in all of this is very interesting, in the sense that, people do have more agency over how their own story is told, right? So like, for the first time for the Western media consumer, the story of Gaza is not coming to them from the lens of a Western journalist, but rather the lens of the people who are actually living the story in real time themselves. I think the big question kind of for all of us right now is, what role do we have to play in terms of fighting against a dehumanizing narrative? How can we amplify certain voices that are on the ground? But I think also very important is, how can we amplify these voices and rehumanize what's happening without increasing and feeding into the polarization and hatred and vileness that is taking place? Because if we look at one of the big byproducts of the dehumanization campaign, when parties are trying to go to war, it is so that we end up accepting, civilian casualties because they are less than. They don't live, love, laugh like the rest of us. And in terms of trying to, again, like rehumanize, we need to also be very careful that we're not feeding into polarization, because that then just splits apart even more. And I do believe that there is a big burden of responsibility on everybody in terms of how we act and react to information, to sort of pause for a second and be like, how do I rationally react to this and actually try to reach a hand across, as opposed to feeding into this like us versus them?
I think Haneen is going to jump in quickly, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, unfortunately. I think we could keep going with this conversation for a while, but yeah, Haneen.
Yeah, for the clusters, we are part for the 4 clusters: protection, wash, food, and health. But unfortunately, there is nothing seen results on the ground, because 2 months ago, UNICEF had a visit for Khartoum, and we had close coordination with them. Then immediately after they left, RSF arrested our volunteers on the ground and started investigating with them. So there was no result. And I think they cannot have any kind of impact for the warring parties, especially in case of Sudan. I don't know about Gaza, but yeah, in case of Sudan.
Yeah, I think because of time, we're going to have to cut it there. A big thank you to all of you for joining the panel today, and for all of you for coming. There is a second panel that really picks up where this one left off, on if not aid, then what, which is sort of thinking about the future of humanitarian action in addition to or outside of the existing system. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break and then come back for that panel. And during the break, I invite you to scan the QR code on the screens, which will give you, take you to a link tree that has a collection of the New Humanitarians reporting on Gaza and Sudan, some of Refugees International's reports, and also links to sign up for both of our email lists, which I'm sure we would be very, very appreciative of you doing if you are not already subscribed. Yeah, so thank you all again, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes for the second part.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started on the next panel. You could come back to your seats, please. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. To those of you who were at the first panel, thank you for staying. If you just came in, thank you for coming. My name is Lena Servostova. I'm the founder of the Center for Transformational Change. We're a social enterprise that looks squarely at the question of community-led social transformation through the narrative power of communities themselves. How do communities work on questions of displacement, climate justice, and inequality writ large through their own stories and through access to the media, to platforms, and to participation in economic and political systems. Thank you to Refugees International and to my partners, the New Humanitarian, for putting this together and for partnering with us. You are at the panel called If Not Aid, Then What? So we're going to be asking the question of what lies beyond the current global humanitarian construct. Given what we just heard on the last panel, for those of you who are here, in the midst of all of these challenges and struggles, I sometimes wonder whether it's even possible to envision a different future. Is it possible to acknowledge and confront our immediate realities while also reimagining new systems? It seems sometimes really like an impossible question. And sometimes it can feel like a frustrating one or even an insulting one. But it's clear we need new vision. We need new responses. Currently, a lot of the people who are doing the rethinking aren't the ones who are in the quote unquote field themselves. They don't live with the realities. It doesn't, I'm quoting a colleague here, it doesn't always touch them on their skin. So the risk in reimagining sometimes is just merely reverting to old ways, just with new faces. I want to know whose voices need to be heard, whose voices are truly being heard, and what are those whose lived experiences are of the oppressions themselves. What are they imagining beyond our current system? So I'm honored that there are 4 people with us who are currently thinking and trying to build beyond. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to just also acknowledge that one of our panelists is not here with us. We were trying to get her here, but the reality is that she couldn't leave Lebanon. So I'm going to introduce you first. Nadine Saba is the co-founder and director of Akar Network for Development, and she enjoys 18 years of experience with NGOs activities in Lebanon. She's a steering committee member of the Lebanon Humanitarian and Development Forum, serving as well in the NEAR Network of Empowered Aid Response Leadership Council, and acts as the NEAR Sherpa for the Grand Bargain and in the facilitation group. She's been involved with rural development programs and relief activities for Syrian refugees, women and youth empowerment, and child protection, along with development projects designed and provided trainings in Lebanon and in the region on local governance and women's empowerment. To my right is Alex Gray, the Director of International Funds for the Center of Disaster Philanthropy. As Director of International Funds, Alex Gray oversees all of the Center of Disaster Philanthropy's global funds and grant making, and manages existing partnerships, cultivates new ones, and ensures that funds are allocated responsibly, equitably, and to the geographies, issues, and populations that need them most. Haneen Ahmed, some of you already met her, is an emergency response room volunteer and Sudanese activist. She initiated the old Omdurman emergency response room, which helps with food supplies, medication, GBV, and evacuation centers. Additionally, she founded a youth network in Sudan to serve civilians' various needs and is a member of Peace for Sudan, a women's group advocating for peace. And last but not least is Arti Krishnan, who is the founder and executive director of Raksha Intelligence Futures and the former head of strategic foresight at UNDP Asia Pacific. In addition to working directly in fragile crisis contexts, Arti has worked for almost 2 decades with senior decision makers across governments, the UN system, and at international organizations on all aspects of risk intelligence, foresight, strategy, and governance. Thank you all for being here. And again, I want to acknowledge that Haneen and Nadine are both sort of at this panel while in the middle of dealing with immediate crises. So I want to thank you for that. I would like to begin the panel by asking you to just do a little bit of musing. I want you to introduce yourselves a little bit more to the audience and the people online, to give us your sort of current context. But what I wanted to know is, like, nearly every time we first discussed the idea of this panel with people, everyone seemed really excited to talk about building a future beyond the current global humanitarian system. So when you first heard about it, how did the idea of building a world beyond aid, how did that land with you? What was your reaction? And I'm going to start, Nadine, I'm going to start with you.
Hello. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, everyone. Honestly, I've been thinking since the morning. For me, it's 5:30, almost more or less, even 6 p.m. now. So I've been thinking since the morning about what to say in these couple of minutes. And I had different things in mind. Would I speak about the situation in Lebanon currently, the actual crisis, the war, the internally displaced people? Would I speak about the Syria crisis, its impact on Lebanon and the region? Would I speak on a more broad lens, looking into what communities and what most local and national NGOs have been facing and still face in every crisis? I honestly did not know where to give priority. Let me first give you an idea of where I come from. I come from a village in a rural governorate of Akkar on the borders with Syria. It's a rural, underprivileged area that had been previously deemed as one of the poverty pockets of the country, and that is displaying currently the highest rate of extreme multidimensional poverty in Lebanon. Its population is around 400,000. You add to this 100,000 Syrian refugees, you add to this in the last 3 days, more than 10,000 internally displaced Lebanese people from the south, a number that is increasing by the hour. At the same time, we have an economic crisis that have depleted the resources of people. We have the Syrian crisis impact that had overburdened the infrastructure. We have risks of food insecurity that are being real in Lebanon, number of children and adolescents out of school that is not decreasing, while the country is facing a political deadlock. Remember, we have had a humanitarian action for the last 10, 13 years with the onset of the Syrian crisis. And the question that I have been looming in my mind is, are we doing better now than we did 10 years ago? Is the situation better? At the time where the main thing that I hear on the global level is the funding gap, I have to ask myself, did we use those resources in the best efficient way? And would that have impacted our readiness for this crisis? And with a fragile context such as Lebanon, a context that is prone to shocks, that is displaying a diversity of these shocks, that have been displaying this diversity for a long period of time, are the tools that we used were the best ones? The best ones not only to respond to the immediate needs, but also to prepare and avoid, if possible, new and additional shocks. Yesterday, I was asked by a colleague, how are you? How are things? And I just vented. I just burst out. I was like, we need mattresses, we need blankets, we need water, we need food, we need dignity kits, we need hygiene kits, we need what is called, CRIs, the core relief items. We need what is called basic assistance. But then I thought, but what would happen within a week? What would happen in a month? What if it lasts even longer? What do we do? What if the conflict expands? What if the risks for our teams, our frontliners, ourselves get even bigger? And I want to salute you, Haneen. I want to salute your volunteers on all the effort that have been done. I've been hearing the first panel, and I feel with you. While I do understand that aid is not supposed to replace the state's institutions, and people and communities ought to rely more on themselves, but the question is also, with all the money and the resources that were put forth, wouldn't have we been able to do things differently, in a better way, providing more agency to the people, allocating more resources to local actors, accepting to take some risks, trusting a local leadership within this intervention, within this operation? So going back to the question, building a world beyond AIDS requires first and foremost accepting to have an honest look into the nature of the crisis and an even more honest look on our response, on the tools that we use and the assumptions that we make when we approach any intervention. At face value, it is a very appealing title, but are we truly ready to delve into it, to push through from the boardrooms and the fora, like the place that we are now, to a field experience? Because the field experience is different. Because the field experience is not what we discuss here. The field experience means the transformation of intermediaries, the transformation of the role of intermediaries. It means having donors with a larger risk appetite. It means questioning the long respected boundaries between humanitarian development, conflict resolution. It means accepting, trying new ventures, and acknowledging and accepting failure sometimes. Because what is happening at the moment is in many instances unrecognized, unacknowledged failure. So if people were excited to talk about such a future, as you mentioned, Lena, a future beyond the current global humanitarian system, then what is holding us back? What is holding us back from walking the walk? Is it about leadership? Who's going to take the lead on it? Who's taking the decisions? Is it where to put the local leadership in this? Is it a fear? Is it the fact that some organizations, intermediaries, do not want to relinquish power? Is it the fear of the unknown? Is it the fear of questioning our practices? I do not know what is holding us back. I wish I did. But what I do know, that in 10 years from now, if we are not bold enough to change within those years, we would be miserably failing our organizations and the sector, but most and foremost, the people that we are supposed to be dealing with, the people that we are supposed to be serving. So I'm not sure if I answered you or added to the confusion, Lena, but this is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You answered it beautifully. Thank you. Alex?
That's a hard act to follow. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? No? Is that better? Yeah, okay, great. So, I mean, I know we're pressed on time, so I'll try and keep this as short as possible. So my name's Alex Gray. I work for the Centre for Disaster Philanthropy, and our mission is to mobilize philanthropy to basically spend money a lot smarter than what they do at the moment. We know, I mean, we can view philanthropy as part of the broader ecosystem of the humanitarian system, or we can view it as something that is often treated, because that's the way it is often treated, as something outside that doesn't interact as much as what we would like it to see from the philanthropy side. I've worked in the, the INGO space, and I've worked in the disaster and conflict and primarily fragile settings for most of my career, but have been in philanthropy now for a few years. I also chair a group of philanthropic donors called the Strengthening Local Humanity and Leadership Collaborative. And we are committed to investing in local leadership, not just in terms of funding local actors, which we can come on to in terms of the grand bargain commitment, but also investing in local infrastructure and systems that that strengthen the local system overall, that allows local humanity and leadership to have greater agency in decision making. And we've done a lot of really interesting stuff, which I hope we'll get into later on. We're here at UNGA. Humanitarian aid is not the summit's focus, but And I liked a few of the ideas being floated around, like, representation through citizens or parliamentary assemblies and new ways of raising funds for public goods that go beyond aid, such as solidarity taxes. But I was also really disappointed to hear folks reading from the same tired old playbook about more money being the solution, because we've seen humanitarianism at its peak. We're not going to close that ever-growing funding gap without tackling the root causes of inequity and vulnerability in the first place. And that means working across the nexus. And so it might be quite controversial to say that I don't think the World Humanitarian Summit was a total failure, because I think the ideas and the principles and the issues it was trying to address were all right, and a lot of good ideas and plans came from that. But the failure was in the leadership to carry that out, and the accountability, and in the change management and the mindset changes that goes with that, to really enact the changes and solutions that were, so invested so much time in developing. And so I do think that, bringing back that term, nexus, I know a lot of people have retired that, but at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we do work with human rights and peace and security and development actors in our response. So where do I stand on this? I mean, I think that we need a two-track approach. One is to evolve the existing aid architecture, and there's some really interesting things that are happening at the moment. I think that we all have a role to play in the ecosystem, but the problem is that the power and resources are so unevenly and inequitably distributed in inverse and quite honestly, like often perverse proportions. Lena, we just spoke about incentives and risk aversion and leadership. And there's just so much current waste in the system. And so what we have been doing in philanthropy and with a number of partners, even in this room, is trying to look at how do we cut out some of that waste. So if we just take localization at its most rudimentary and simplistic of definitions, which did it an injustice, this 25% going to local actors, it's so simple and is not really, in my view, what it's about is about equitable partnerships. One of our partners, we just, the Share Trust and the Warranty Advisory Center, and more recently with Refugees International, we did this Passing the Buck study in Ukraine. But they've published a series of studies looking at the efficiency gains you could get within the current system by enacting this 25%. And I mean, it's using economic data to support it. And so it showed that channeling funding via local intermediaries could yield efficiency gains as high as 32% compared to international intermediaries. And in the global north, intermediaries are often what they say is where they feel most comfortable giving money to. But if that was local intermediaries, you've got most of that funding gap sorted out already, just from that 32%. Based on actual project data, in Ukraine alone in 1 year, 2023-24, if 25% of funding was deployed to the local actors who were getting some of those funds, you would have saved $256 million in 1 year that could have went to more programs, more local actors, and more impact. And so, the other thing is the UN system itself is charging 2.5 times the cost for international staff as compared to INGOs with the exact same staff, and up to 28 times more for the same staff in local organizations. And so reforming the current system would close that funding gap, just if you put power and agency in the hands of those that are closest to the point of action of impact. And so a few things I would call for is full transparency from all actors on budgets and financing and how it goes. And even between our bilateral governments and the UN agencies, they are not required to report back on how they're spending their money in a very transparent way. Passing through overheads, at CDP, we use a tiered system where local actors, the more local you are, the higher percentage of indirect costs and support costs that you get, compared to INGOs who get a smaller proportion. And then also a big role for philanthropy, which I hope to talk about today, is investing in innovation and new ways of working. As someone who works in philanthropy every day, I see so many in piloting different ways of doing localization, and the best results I've seen is when we partner with local actors, local humanitarian leadership, and communities directly. Because from where I sit, we have the solutions, we have the leadership, but we just don't have the political will and the decision-making power sitting in the hands of the right leadership in order to take these solutions, like local pooled funding mechanisms, like survivor and community-led response, like, just giving cash, and we'll talk about that later, like investing in social enterprise as a humanitarian response, so that local actors can generate their own profit and income and help their own communities, like investing in movements and movement building as a humanitarian intervention. And so I would just end with saying that the one hope I have is that the vast majority of people in the system do want to see the change. There are solutions, and it's just about putting the power and agency in the hands of the right people that have those solutions. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Haneen, the same question to you. How do you react to the question of building a future beyond aid?
I would say that ERRs already start building the future of the humanitarian aid by creating and innovating new ways to collaborate with other local actors and international actors. And also in the emergency response room, that we don't know each other, we're coordinating through WhatsApp groups. So these WhatsApp groups help us to build a trust through the year. So the majority of my colleagues, I don't know them personally, we don't even met, but we are working like brothers and sisters, and we believe that the genuine brothers and sisters can change this humanitarian system to the humanitarian system jamming with the situations and different situations on the ground. Thank you.
Arti, the same question to you.
Thanks, Lena. I must apologize. I've got a throaty voice. This is like the last panel for the week I'm on. So let me put some context before I answer this question. I was born in Malaysia. My grandparents were brought to Malaysia as indentured slaves to work on the railroads. My grandparents were recipients of aid. And I guess now, in one generation, 2 generations later, I live in New York City. I run my own firm. And I'm sitting here in a position of privilege. I feel quite uncomfortable sitting here because I do think that nobody needs to hear from people with privilege anymore. And I would much rather spend the time learning from Haneen and Nadine. So there's 2 things in which I'm going to respond to this. I'm going to do it with grace, and I'm going to do it with truth and honesty, and I'm not going to use the tired old words we're hearing: local actors, communities, nexus. What do they mean? We've had this question asked of us, and I've spent the majority of my career in the humanitarian system, by the way, very much started in the field and somehow ended up here. We've been asking this question for so long. I think the New Humanitarian convened its first discussion on this in COVID in 2020. How many times have we asked this? I don't know how many panels I've been on in Humanitarian Congress, and there's all asking about what's next beyond the aid system. My question then is, if we've been asking for it, what's prevented it from happening? If everybody's excited about it, as my friend said earlier, then surely we should be interrogating what it is that prevents us from shifting anything. The humanitarian architecture doesn't exist in a silo. It sits very complicitly in systems of capitalism and in power, and in member states' power. So the fact that most of us will not call out or feel that we can't use specific words for specific things, as outlined by the panel this morning. The fact that we cannot say genocide or pogrom or any of the other truths of the reality that sit on our skin of this conflict and the wars that our brethren are experiencing. And yet we have to wrap it in much more nicer words, I think, speaks to why I don't want to imagine a world beyond aid. What I want to imagine is a world where states can be held to account for blatantly contravening international humanitarian law. I want to imagine a world where people can get access, children are not blown up, people can get access to food, people don't have to work 3 jobs just to be able to put food on the table. And this isn't a global south, global north conversation, so to speak. We see these levels of injustices and inequity even here in the United States, depending on which community you're speaking to. If you're going to go bankrupt for sending your kid to the hospital, that's not an equitable system. So I want to see a world, I want to imagine a world where we tackle and have the bravery and the strength within our heart and soul to look at evil in the eye, and I will call it out for what it is, and say, no, I believe people aren't, as I can't remember who on the panel said this earlier, maybe it was Alex, people don't just suffer from starvation, they are being starved. People don't suffer from not being able to grow their own food. They're not given access or networks or money. These are very specific designed programs in order to other all of us. And as long as we sit in spaces of othering, cruelty will happen. So that's what I want to imagine. The aid system, I want to maybe I recast that in my head after about 20 years in multilateralism. To me now, solidarity, how do I see you as a whole person? How do I extend care? How do I fight with you for the injustices that you are? There was somebody in the audience that talked about the experience of being an Arab American. I can't remember who it was. And I want to be able to proudly stand up and be an ally with that. I think humanitarians, we get so caught up in this idea of what being a humanitarian is, that we forget that fundamentally it's about standing up for the issues that we believe in. The humanitarian system was designed on principles, on a system of principles. It should have been designed, and maybe that was right for that time, coming out of the Second World War. But those global principles, those global constructs, social constructs that we held together for so long are fast being rewound. We're going backwards in time. And it doesn't matter which, we can call out Sudan, we can call out Gaza, we can call out Australia. I'm Australian. I think that the principles that we signed up to under the global humanitarian architecture, under the global aid architecture, are fast being unwound. I don't think we have the system in any way has any teeth in anything else. When I want to look for hope, it's the question about who's running into the fire rather than who's running away from the fire, who's stepping in and working out different ways of providing basic medical care, of who is opening up their homes. I am supporting the work that I want to support and we saw this when Afghanistan fell, were the WhatsApp groups that were forming up, trying to get friends, family, anybody out of danger, which is also what's happening now. So in short, do I want to imagine a world beyond aid? I'd much rather imagine a world beyond cruelty.
Thank you. I think you just laid out our whole panel. But let's stay with this question for just a little bit. I want to talk, before we talk about the future or what lies beyond aid, what lies beyond cruelty, let's talk a little bit about the present. One of the principles that I think holds the humanitarian sector back, and Nadine has you and I have spoken about this quite a bit, is almost the industrialization, right, of this sector with its own jargon, its own acronyms, it's all these, sort of, it's silos. But one of the things that does hold the sector back is this question of neutrality, right? Like, how do humanitarian organizations keep saying that they want to balance a commitment to neutrality, right, with the reality of crises? How can organizations keep clinging to that idea, given the state of the world right now? How do we sort of move the sector beyond that if the sector is going to survive? Who wants to take that? Honey, go ahead.
So I just going to share our experience in the emergency response room. Even when they want to appoint me as a former representative in the United States, they did a background check on, do I have any kind of political affiliation, or do we have, although I was a resistance committee, but I don't have any kind of political affiliation, because any kind of political affiliation or talk about politics or even involve your personal ideas on politics or what's going on right now, in our situation, it will harm our colleagues on the ground. For keeping our bodies safe and keep our colleagues safe on the ground or protect our body, we cannot involve ourselves or anyone who wants to advocate. We prevent anyone to advocate on behalf of emergency response room, except the representative, the former representative from the emergency response room, to talk about that, because that sometimes people take it as a personal thing, especially in such events that included Sudanese Force Army or people from government. They take it personally, or that person who was affiliated, for example, to Freedom and Change and right now advocate. So that ERRs is affiliated to the Freedom and Change, that play bad political games, and this is a chance they use it. So we just keep neutral, talking on the humanitarian, no involvement for any sides. Only we have, and this is very obvious on our paper and our documentation and on the advocacy.
Yeah. Many years ago, I was one of the co-authors of the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent's Global Strategy for 2030. And we went through a massive process of consultation for this. One of the things that came out from that was the mumbling that perhaps the fundamental principles of the Red Cross that's bound by the Geneva Conventions needs to be rethought. So this was back in like 2016, 2017. And the concept of neutrality was coming out a lot in that. How do we remain neutral in the face of such cruelty? I don't think the answer is a black and white one. I think certainly there are incredible repercussions to human life if you are perceived to take a certain way. But I think in the same time, we tend to, for those sitting in the comforts of white towers somewhere else, tend to hide behind concepts of neutrality for issues to protect the institution from issues of power, about funding, about where they're getting their money from, about how they can distribute that money. So I do think we have to look at the concepts of neutrality through plurality. In which ways and in which context do they unfold? And in some components, particularly in the institutional sense, I do very strongly believe that the concept of neutrality, perhaps maybe the fundamental principles, all need to be rethought of and recast in the age that we're in, and not a blanket, let's be neutral in the face of this, when it's actually a way for us to not take a stand. So I want to look about my years, very long career in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement in the UN, and sometimes I feel a sense of shame, deep shame, that we hide behind these phrases because we are afraid of losing our funding. We talk about UNRWA this morning, right? And how many people felt the impact of not being able to speak out against the states that chose to withdraw funding straight away. Australia was one of them, and I felt embarrassed. but we must speak the truth. We have to be neutral when people's lives are at stake, but it is not a blanket option. And in my experience and in my expertise, we've lost the way because we took that as a blanket to absolve ourselves of our own accountability.
Nadine, I want to ask you the same question, but I also want you to, Arti just mentioned sort of headquarters and boardrooms and such, and I want to know from you, like, how can the humanitarian sector connect the real challenges faced by, say, local communities or, whatever we're calling them in crisis zones, with the often abstract discussions happening in boardrooms, and boardrooms that are adhering to this principle of neutrality? How do we bridge that gap between theory and actual experience of people in crisis? But also, is it even the right question to ask? Like, do we want to focus on what people in boardrooms are thinking?
Well, a couple of comments. First, when we are talking about neutrality, I do agree with Arati on the fact that it's not a black and white answer. However, a couple of notes. First, while I do agree on the centrality of protection, while I do agree on the fact that humanitarian work entails some additional responsibilities in some aspects, however, what I've been seeing in some places is the use of neutrality or principles of humanitarian work to push aside local actors. So for me, this is one of the comments they would put forth in terms of this gap between the boardroom and the understanding of neutrality and the actual work on the ground. So for me, the use of principles in a way to just remain with the traditional players is also sometimes an excuse to eliminate a bit of the local leadership. That's my first comment. My second comment is, what is neutrality for each and every one? What is neutrality for an organization? Does it mean that the person who works within this organization or who leads that organization or who volunteers in that organization is no longer entitled to an opinion? Or does it mean that we as an organization, we have within our teams a multitude, a difference of opinions, of perspectives, however, the organization itself doesn't endorse one or another? So also it goes back into what it is, because you as a person, or one as a person, when goes, at least I'll speak for a local organization, when they want to work, when they start within a social work, when they start within their work, it's coming either from a need in that community that is not met, either from a problem that they faced, or that there is something that pushed them to ameliorate, to improve. This is how most local organizations get started, because they want to do something in their community. So at one point, if you are telling them you need to be cut off from everything that's happening around you, you just need to do 1 + 2 = 3. Aren't we losing the essence of what is driving them? Aren't we losing this drive, this something that pushes them to go the extra mile? So what is neutrality for each one of us? If we go and talk, at least for the 4 of us, we might have different perspectives of neutrality. So how do you expect all organizations to have the same understanding of neutrality?
Sure, Nadine, I'm just snapping. Absolutely right. And I wish so much you were here. There's a couple, we're not neutral bodies. As human beings, we're not neutral bodies. And I cannot agree with her more when she talked about that we hide behind this as a way of then forcing out local markets, local actors, local employees from not doing jobs. I don't know how many disaster response initiatives I've been in, particularly in Asia Pacific, when we're going into a Pacific island that's faced a cyclone or whatever. And, we're not hiring We're not hiring local contractors to rebuild. We're paying $120,000 to fly in the logistics expert from somewhere else. And what that does is it doesn't get the market up and running. So are we really neutral, or are we just there to protect ourselves? And again, when we talk about neutrality, I mean, how many of us were pushing back against the images that are being portrayed in humanitarian action? I remember once, and I won't mention the organization, and I think it was in Sudan, and the doctor or whatever, and he is white, he's got his Bose headphones on, he's got his Timberlands on, and he's leaning down at a black child as the black child is holding his hand. Is that neutral? You cannot argue neutrality when you don't see black and brown bodies as whole bodies deserving, that not deserving, that have dignity and are whole people. So it comes down to how we turn up in the world, what values we have, as Nadine said, individually, and do we see ourselves as the white knight coming in, so to speak, or the brown knight coming in, or whichever way, to save the situation.
Let's stay with local.
I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just small example. 3 months ago, some of people want to talk about emergency response rooms, and they have a political affiliation. Immediately, we have a lady get raped by RSF. 3 of our colleagues get tortured after this speech. So I don't know, maybe they are right, but keep not talking about just the humanitarian aid only, not politics. No, this is a neutrality from our perspective as emergency response rooms.
I just want to add like one just minor point. I think that you know, and I don't think as human beings like you can ever be truly neutral to the things that we're talking about, because they're human beings. You know, and I do believe that we all have and have this essence of humanity within us, and we see it in others. And so you may not be able to be neutral. I am often not able to be neutral, but I think there's a distinction between, just to go off what Hanina was saying, there's a distinction between being neutral and being perceived to be neutral in order to be able to protect space and to protect communities. And I think that, you know, educating and folks, I mean, that are working, and you know, humanitarian workers particularly, in that difference and knowing that it's a difference, but like saying it's okay to not be neutral, because let's just call it for what it is. Like, we're not, I'm sure we all have feelings about all the conflicts that are going on around the world and the terrible things that are happening to people who are suffering as a result of that and dying as a result of that. But I do think that, you know, for me, and it would back up what Hanine is saying, is that the difference between, you know, when you talk to someone on a one-to-one basis, and you know it's okay to not be neutral because you can't be, but for, you know, externally, there are many reasons why it's very important to be perceived to be neutral.
Thank you. Let's stay on question of local organizations and their leadership, whether it's their leadership in response or in reimagining. We have the problem, as we said, we have the problem with neutrality. We also have the problem of silos, right? Where organizations are expected to do one thing and one alone, or they're expected to bring not their entire whole selves, as Aarti and Hanine have talked about, and Nadine as well. So Hanine, I want to ask you, in your context, how do you and ER volunteers balance sort of responding to immediate needs on the ground, the impact of the war, and also innovating and remaining agile? Like, how are you balancing all of this?
Well, I think this is different, and this is what keeps us unique. I cannot explain how difficult for us to stay response for the emergency or urgent need coming from the ground for 20. So it's not 24/7; it's 48 in 24. It's too hard with time differences and different and a lot of needs sometimes coming on the same time. For example, right now we have a massive evacuation in two areas in Khartoum. And also at the same time, we have rape cases and disappeared women in other states in Sudan. So we are working on both things at the same time. So it's a lot of work on our side. It also keeps us traumatized because you get sad news from the ground. But the decentralization of the ERRs, this is the way that we innovate and we learn from the past experience. The centralization of the work keeps the work very tough on people and a lot of duties. But the decentralization allows us to work in different contexts with different capacities. As Alex said, that with our partners, we are able to build our capacity. So we are become more flexible to work with different tasks. And also we have a system called F system. F system, it's which is F1, which is the need coming from the ground. The base room delivers this need in the report. And then we have F2, which is sorting committee deciding with whether this needs going further or not. And F3, which is a contract between the state and the base rooms. F4, which is a financial report, shows that the invoices and all the financial documents for the sake of accountability to our community first, ourselves and our donors. Also, we have F4, which is narrative or program report, shows that the activity done on the ground. So this is how we stay agile and we stay innovative. And we need more recognition and more support to stay agile as a movement that we are preparing ourselves for the day after.
Thank you. Nadine, the same question to you. Like, how are you at Accra? How are you balancing the immediate needs and sort of looking to the future, especially given the fact that you have no resources right now?
I agree with a lot of what Haneen had mentioned in terms of the requirements and the deliverables that we provide. But I think it also goes back into the question of what are we asking of the local actors versus what are we providing them with? At one point, it feels like local actors have this burden of excellence, are required to always do more with less. And it is true. And a lot of times we do it. I'll give you a small example. Our team at the moment was cooking some hot meals to be provided as dinner for the people who are displaced in the collective shelters. And at one point, we're like, where do we have the kitchen? Where do we put it? We had to talk to one mayor. He was able to give us the location. We had to talk to somebody else to give us some kind of first raw material to get done with. So at one point, it's just like you have to do it. You do not have the luxury of thinking so what do we do after that? How do we do it? At one point, you just need to roll your sleeves, do it and move. But at the same time, when you do such things, you wonder exactly what I was saying in the beginning, what would happen after 1 week? Because at one point, the people would not be able to give you anything. The people had to look into their own needs as well. So you do it I would say, in a very organic way. So when you look into what you have, you try to do it in a way that helps, for example, the local farmer who is in your area, who is in your village, to make sure that have kind of a cycle in your community. You have to work in a sense that when you provide something to some people, you tell them that, you know what, at one point we might need you as well to help us with X, Y, Z. When you work with youth and you teach them and you do trainings with them and you ask them to help, for example, in the COVID, when you ask them to help in the distribution of masks, when you ask them to help in the cholera campaign, when you ask them to help in such things, I believe that certain things come organically. However, what needs to be done is to provide additional resources to local actors to do it in a systematic way. And when I'm speaking about resources, it is not always necessarily money. Yes, money is needed, but sometimes other things are needed as well. When you ask me to do certain things, you might want to give me access to a software. You might want to give me access to some additional information to train my people. So at one point, having these immediate long-term needs is what you do in an organic way, but it's not always systematic, and it's not always done in the best way because you do it with whatever you have. You could do it much better when you have additional resources in your hands.
So building on that, I have a question for both Arti and Alex on this. So both Haneen and Nadine have basically described what is an organic, integrated, full self approach to a certain extent. The crises that we are dealing with are, they're increasingly protracted, and they each are subject to external shock after shock after shock. So given that, given both of your perspectives, how do we start thinking about the questions of anticipatory action, right? How do we prevent the most dire effects of these shocks? How do we work with local communities to prepare them for this? What are you both seeing, and what are you both doing about this?
Go for it. Yeah, sure. So, I mean, at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we specifically fund recovery and resilience because it's so underfunded. We produce a report every year called the State of Disaster Philanthropy, and I mean, it's always massively underfunded. I think resilience and preparedness is it varies between 4% and 5% every year of all disaster funding, humanitarian funding, and the same goes for recovery when we know that that's when the most needs are. So, as Nadine was talking about, I'll just give you an example of the cost of, again, it goes back to cost efficiencies. I think transferring what philanthropy is kind of like moving towards is trust-based philanthropy. And so we've invested a lot over the last few years with organizations like the Vital Foundation and Legatum Foundation, and we're local to Global Protection and some other actors like Christian Aid and Danish Church Aid, and this survivor and community-led response, which basically is just transferring cash to communities. There's often a local accompaniment model attached to it as well, but it's putting in place systems where the local, it's similar to what we're funding. We just launched a big commitment at the Clinton Global Initiative that Haneen and I were at together on Monday to try to invest more into mutual aid. And so we are generating a lot of evidence through that as well. And what we are finding so far is that, I was in Kenya, and a congressional delegation came out the week after us. USAID had spent $10 million in this area just doing cash and food distributions, and it was gone, and there was nothing left sustainable. We invested a few $100,000 and allowed the community to choose what to do with it, and they were able to build irrigation channels and get their agricultural practices back up and running, and develop women's cooperatives, etc., for an absolute tiny fraction of the price. And the yield was far greater, and it was sustainable. And to be able to just look at something that costs less than a tenth of the price, because you're allowing the community to decide what is your problem? Where do you see the best solution? Your context. You are having the discussions. And so we are a big advocate and are doing a lot of research into creating the evidence to be able to advocate to the broader system to just transfer over that money, because all the evidence that comes out, similar to where cash programming was. I mean, I remember when people thought you were crazy for giving over cash instead of, non-food items. And that was a long battle. And We actually, narrative was a big part of shifting that. And now, like, you know, it's minimum each year is at least 25% of humanitarian funding goes to cash. And it's just an accepted modality now. And so why can't we do that with bigger grants at the community level? And that's what we are doing in philanthropy with a number of our partners. And the results we see are exponentially greater impact per dollar than what the current system is generating.
Arti. Thanks, Lena. So I think what Haneen and Adine very correctly and rightfully illustrate is we exist in a plurality of realities here, right? What we may think in one way from a boardroom governance perspective is completely different from when you're on the ground responding. So I'm going to answer this question very much from a governance perspective, which is the space I operate in. So, I run Raksha Intelligence Futures. We are an advanced risk intelligence organization. What we do is we work with multilaterals, international organizations, philanthropy, around how do we get better at understanding the drivers of crises, the intersecting connectors that might tip a situation into crises way in advance. So we're going beyond the anticipatory action timeline, beyond your 3 weeks or even arguably 3 months, to take it longer. And we have a sort of a three-prong, we look at 3 indicators. And it's based on the hypothesis of these are one element, one framework of understanding what states over into crises. A, how fiscally resilient is the state in its ability to withstand whatever shock is coming its way? What is the level of transparency around its governance structures and its systems? And what is the level of trust between its citizens and its policymakers? And usually what we can see, and again, this is not a perfect science, it's a hypothesis, that when one of those levers get tipped over, the state could still be okay. But once 2 or more get tipped over because of intersecting, connecting risks and shocks, it collapses. So our argument is, look, every single thing we're talking about here, we could see a mile off coming, we just didn't pay attention. The same thing was COVID, Afghanistan, Lebanon now. The triggers, the drivers, the root causes, which is always politics, always economics, always a fight for resources. If we can be better prepared, and if we can turn that level of understanding the intelligence into ways in which those in these governance positions can make decisions in advance, then yes, the investment into adaptation is worth much more than the investment into response. But this is an age-old argument. It's been the same thing for preparedness arguments. It's been the same thing for everything. How do we invest? How do we argue for the investment into something when it may or may not occur? So A, we got to get better at that. B, I sit in a lot of closed-door discussions that are confidential with different heads of embassies or multilaterals in a particular context, because they're concerned about a particular thing that is looking it's going to happen in the horizon. So we do a lot of this work. The hardest bit about that is getting different organizations with different mandates, all under the same architecture, to go beyond their mandate, to go beyond what they have to do with an institutional hat, and to actually come together as a system to solve problem X, and not try and bring their own solutions to put the cart before the horse, so to speak, before that's actually eventuated. And a lot of the work we do isn't data. We use a lot of data, but a lot of it is how do you influence human behavior in a way that heads of these organizations that have to make risky decisions will feel that they can make those risky decisions. And and I will say this based on fact, most senior decision makers will not make a risky decision unless they're protected from above. So if we want to talk about investing into mitigating or adapting triggers of crises before they actually become a crisis. Then we also need to talk about the systems of risk appetite, as Nadine talked about earlier, the systems of decision-making. How do leaders, and this is the question I get a lot, and nobody's got an answer to it. How do you make a decision in deep uncertainty? Now, I'll waffle on for 2 more minutes because I just want to make this point. The triggers that we're experiencing now are not siloed. We can't talk about conflict by itself. We can't talk about climate by itself. We can't talk about geopolitical issues by itself. They are all interconnected. But our institutions and governance structures are run on risk matrices of silos. For those of you that have had the unfortunate experience of having to fill out a risk matrix for your organization, and you're all smiling at me, so I know you feel the pain. But it's hard enough to price a current risk, let alone an emerging risk. When you cannot, let alone risks that are interconnected, it's very hard to get a system around that. If you cannot assign impact and probability around interconnected risks over a longer term time frame, you can't price it. When you can't price the risk, you can't govern the risk. When you can't govern the risk as an institution, who bears the brunt of it downstream? The most disenfranchised, the most fragile of all of us. And for us that sit in these positions, we go, well, that's a downstream problem. Let me worry about that later. I need to make sure I get my funding from X, Y, Z. So that's what we're fundamentally trying to change. It is hard because how do we take off the institutional hat that allows people, these institutions that are doing, I mean, I guess at a mandate level, depending on which organization, really good work that we want them to do, to just do it. And it gets caught up. I don't know how many boardrooms I've sat in here in New York where there is no mention of community. It's like sitting in a McKinsey boardroom. Suddenly I'm talking about pricing and investments versus human lives. So that's an incredible, even between this conversation, you can sense the disconnect. Yeah, it's a complicated question, but I think there are ways in which we can get to muddling our way through it.
So when we're going to start transitioning to questions, when I was preparing for this panel, I had what might be at least 4 to 5 hours of questions. And I whittled it down and I had like 90 minutes of questions. I had 4 thematic topics. We got to 1. So I'm going to ask a question that is going to sound like it is sort of coming maybe out of nowhere. But before we go to questions, I want you each to sort of think about and answer the question, what would happen if there were no boardrooms and headquarters? Like, is there a point at which humanitarian response and response to climate, displacement, war, all of these things are handled only by communities? And we can say, we don't need you, you need us. Is there a point that's coming in the future?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Of course. Is there a point at which most of humanitarian response or responses for the collective care of communities is handled by communities themselves? And we can say to the people who haven't been listening, you need us. We don't need you.
Of course, we cannot say to anyone, we don't need you, even people who are our enemies. We always need people to be in our side. And this is what the idea of tolerance and trust building that we are working on it. We are trying to have less enemies as much as we can, have a wide wave of tolerance going on with different civil societies. I cannot say that we don't have a problem with different civil societies or with international organizations, some of them, but we are trying as much as we can to solve this problem or try to find ways to collaborative and work closely together. Because at the end of the day, we are one family, one world, and we want to build a new system that everyone who cares about anyone. So this is the idea of equality and sharing resources from perspective of love first. And, this is the idea of the emergency response room. I'm so sorry I have to leave. I have another meeting. Thank you for your listening, and I hope that can be beneficial for you.
Thank you, Haneen. We have a few more minutes. So before we get to questions, if you wanted to talk about collective care and love and mutual aid.
So I very much believe in the principles of plurality, that multiple truths are true at the same time. And I think depending on context, we need multiple versions of this. I do, and we already see this, that your community responding to you and your needs, we see it all over the world, is far more effective. You're trusted, you understand your neighbors, you understand what's going on, you know where to go, all these things that we know about. I think that the role international organizations play might need to shift quite considerably because of two things. Their age of relevance, even with their host governments or sponsoring governments or member states, is shifting dramatically. Their ability to have access and their positioning and to get funding is shifting incredibly, and even their convening power. And if we've seen that in the last few weeks, in terms of trying to pass any kind of arguably logical resolutions to world crises, is decreasing. We can't even get there. So what's that shifting role? Fundamentally, I do think that depending on what you're talking about in humanitarian response, decentralized networks and communities of care are incredibly important, but I will always support what Adine is saying. The role we ought to be playing is getting resources, networks, access, making their jobs easier, and not putting the burden of being excellent on them, or the burden of always having to be resilient on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I agree with all of that. As I was mentioning, Haneen and I were, with a commitment of a broad range of actors, made a commitment at the CGI this week to invest in Sudan specifically and in mutual aid there. And it was, we've been investing in mutual aid for quite some time. At CDP, we always, we have an education arm, and we're trying to educate donors about the fact that it is your neighbor, like who's there first whenever something happens. It is your neighbor, it is your community, and they do know best. And so, even before localization was even used as a term, I came into the sector 2 decades ago from management consulting. And, I just looked at the way the system was set up and was like, this needs to be decentralized. That was my first job, was decentralizing as low as possible the budgets and resources talking about risk, to give boards assurance that they were not going to get caught out and it wasn't going to be a financial or fiduciary risk for them. A couple of things that was interesting this week is, at CGI, we held this immersion exercise, like a simulation, where we got even corporates and philanthropy and governments and local actors together, and just their aversion to risk, even in the private sector, is pretty shocking. So I would say that initiatives like the Pledge for Change, which Degan Ali and Deso kind of led, where that was a long process getting INGOs in a room at the CEO level over a period of time to really look at what is the evolving role. And Ringo is another good initiative for this that WACSI is leading in West Africa, and but looking at what is an alternative role for some of these international players. And it is exactly what Artie's saying, is convening and providing a platform for communities that are affected to have voice and agency, making introductions. I mean, I view that as part of my role in philanthropy, is, working together. Just one very quick example is, 2 partners, one in Venezuela, the Wayutai Foundation, and in Adesso in Somalia. We worked across with Hilton Foundation and the Gates Foundation, and we all, pulled money together to help them develop water enterprises that were profit-making, so that there didn't need to be dependence on foreign water trucking, I mean, which is just insane for, 10 years in the same area in Somalia because no one had invested in any infrastructure. Whereas now, in these areas, you have water treatment plants and, boreholes that are accessible and pipe water to people's houses for literally, I mean, less than a tenth of the price. And so, for us, I do think decentralization and supporting local leadership to work together in networks and movements that already exist. And just one last thing I'll say on that is we work a lot more closely now with the human rights and peace and security groups because those networks, we primarily fund those networks now because the movements are already there, and they're already deep in the communities and they have deep trust. And so we find that's the most effective way to not only transfer agency, but to make maximum use of resources, the limited resources that we have.
Thank you. And Nadine?
For me, my main problem is not having the boardroom. My main problem is how the boardroom is interacting with locals, how the boardroom is seeing the power dynamics with the locals. I do understand that when you're on the field, you see things from a perspective, and then when you just take a step back, you see them from a different perspective. And this is what a boardroom could do. And this is what something, but for me is how they conduct themselves with local actors. And here I'm talking local organizations, state institutions, networks of organization. Second is how they measure or how they understand efficiency, how they measure impact, and how they understand risk. And speaking about risk, when you were mentioning risks, imagine that not only just you do the matrix and then you check first risk, currency devaluation, we had that. Second risk, pandemic, we had that. Third risk, explosion, we had that in Lebanon. Add to that now, fourth risk, war, we had that. Then do you imagine the feeling and the pressure that we as locals have? And when I say as locals, and I think there is one individuality or specificity for local NGOs is that for the community, they are part of the system and they are part of the sector that sometimes fails them. And for us, we believe that, yes, we see the failure, we see the issues, and sometimes we have very little power to change. And this is where I say that my problem is not with the existence of the boardroom. My problem is with the conduct of that boardroom. My problem is with the power of that boardroom. My problem is with the equality, the peer-to-peer between the boardroom and what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Sure, right there.
Hi, thanks so much. First of all, for a really sort of refreshing panel discussion here today. My name's Chris Frassetto. I worked with ICRC for almost a decade. My question is sort of bringing us back to accountability. As you know, humanitarian organizations aren't often very willing to engage operational humanitarian organizations in an accountability discussion. And there's a lot of reasons for this, coming back to worry about compromising humanitarian principles, worry about retaliation, whether that's access denial, expulsion, or worse. And in some cases, there are actual immunities for organizations that prevent giving evidence or in a testimony in an illegal proceeding. On the flip side, accountability is a very powerful tool for increasing the global protection network or having an impact on very cyclical nature of many protracted crises. So if humanitarians are not really willing to be the champion for accountability, who can sort of fill this void, in your opinion, in terms of mobilizing governments and the international architecture that we do have for accountability?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who wants to take that one? Nadine?
Sorry, I'm going to be a bit cynical. Do you really think that as humanitarians, anybody is being able to hold any government accountable? And then going back to the neutrality question, how do we balance the neutrality requirement with the accountability requests? I am all for accountability. But then aren't we asking for one thing and the opposite? I ought to see that. I would love to see that. Don't get me wrong. But I'm just answering because I felt that I heard different mixed signals within this. I do believe that humanitarians ought to raise their voices, ought to speak the truth. But at the same time, are we being able, what are we waiting on the balance? Are we really being able to affect that? Or is it because we're only talking ourselves? Is it because we're working in silos? Is it because we're not talking with other practitioners in different other sectors? I think that our voices are not that much heard, maybe potentially because of a bit of our own deeds, because we have portrayed ourselves in a sense as being this elitist kind of holding on to principles while the others might not be holding on to those principles.
Thank you. Arthina.
Knew there'd be a fellow Red Crosser in the audience. So I think before I answer that, I want to perhaps reframe it in a slightly different way. I think we're talking about humanitarian organizations, but the role of humanitarianism and the role different organizations play is very blurred at this point. You can argue, I came from UNDP and they would want to do humanitarian work and the argument was always, why can't we access humanitarian funding and why is it always going to humanitarians? And that blur is happening. I think if we're talking about accountability to whom? Upstream or downstream? Why? What is the purpose and the objective behind that accountability? Now, if we're talking about access during a humanitarian crisis, so the work ICRC does, MSF, World Central Culture, like fundamentally life-saving work, that they need to do that, then they do also have to juggle that upstream accountability in some way. But then if they cannot be truthful because of a variety, look, let's speak the honest truth here. All of this is issues of power. It's about geopolitical power. It's about money. That's it. That's it. And that may be cynical, but that's fundamentally it. Now, if organized institutions that are trying to do life-saving work need to be a little bit careful because of repercussions or funding or anything, it doesn't mean that the whole system has to be silent. There are many, many, many other institutions that can pick up the slack, that can speak up when others can't. And right now, we don't. We just don't. UNRWA, what happened with UNRWA was horrific. How many organizations, other UN agencies also spoke up at the same time? So again, existing in plurality, where one part of the system has to act in a certain way, other parts of the system can act the other ways in which to balance it out. And right now we don't, as Nadine has said, because we don't want to, I think we're all hiding, Nadine, scared, I don't know. Yeah, I do know, but I don't want to say it out loud, but yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask a question I was going to do one from the chat.
We don't have to, okay, we're going to do one from the chat, yeah. Sorry.
And first. We can get them both at the same time.
Okay, we can get both. Yeah, sure, thanks.
Okay. So, whose hand was it? Back here. Somebody have a question?
Do you want to start? Do you want to start from the chat first or from me?
No, you can go ahead, please.
This is Mustafa Ali. I'm the co-managing director for Refugee Seat. I think just kind of maybe a couple comment and question. I hope, soon that we start moving a little bit away from the idea of bringing voices or amplifying voices. I think the voices of the local communities and refugees on the ground are already there. Maybe we need to bring a little bit more ears to hear those voices, than not kind of the other way around. But I think on also the idea of it's a dangerous rhetoric, I think right now, where some people trying to make the play as either the local community or the INGOs and the UN system. I think this is not what we have been trying to advocate on the ground. Maybe the best case scenario is around co-management system. That needs to happen a lot more. And this is something where still far from happening. But then the idea, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there is a need for UN and INGO system, but at the same time, there is a need for the local organization and that kind of collaborative approach. And I think the conversation should go around the co-management. It's not about who replaced the other. The last kind of a question, Alex, also kind of a little bit for you. It was interesting when you mentioned, like that local organizations or UN bodies or employees will get 28 times more kind of the local organization. And I feel also sometimes there is also this kind of a rhetoric where like you go to the local organization or refugee-led organization because it's cheaper. I think now we're just trying to use a little bit more effective. But there is also an important thing where, yes, maybe the UN pay is at the extreme high, but also the local organization is that extreme low. So is there also kind of something in the studies where what is the balance? What is the middle point? What is fair for the local organization? It should not be always the case right now being promoted that, we should go with the local organization just because they are cheap and they can get you much more. But then is there some studies is also that how far those local organizations and actors on the ground from making at least fair and decent living for doing the work they're doing in that way? That's it.
Yeah. I mean, sure. Oh, this is a question.
So from online, from Amber Cripps, who's an anthropologist who works on gender mainstreaming in humanitarian aid. She says, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. She loves the discussion about power dynamics with local actors. I'm interested in how aid can better take into account diversity and gender dynamics within the quote community, unquote, which duplicates the level of power dynamics. I assume she means at a higher level. So thank you.
Alex, do you want to take the first question?
Sure, I can take the first one. I don't want to misquote the studies, like in terms of exactly how I'm going to respond to this, but parity was taken into account when we were calculating that, so that makes the findings even more shocking. And yeah, so I would encourage you to read them. The Passing the Buck reports, they're very digestible, but that was considered because we're obviously don't want, I mean, it's not about, I'll go with local organizations because they're cheaper. It's paying equivalent, achieving parity for the same work, right? So that was built into the studies. So that would be the first thing I would say on that. I agree with what you were saying about, when we talk about elevating voices, yeah, you do need to bring the ears. I've never heard it said that way before, but I'm going to steal it now from going forward because I think it's a good one. But I think one of the things that I feel like we're in a pivotal moment now, even without getting into the whole global governance mechanism. And this UNGA was particularly interesting in terms of, some of the agreements that were signed and the discussions that were had around power sharing and what the Security Council was going to do. Now, obviously, they say a lot of things and they don't ever follow through, and there's the accountability issue again. But I do think that there is a kind of middle ground, because I agree with you. There is a need for these institutions because look at what's happening around the world right now, and with the leadership in those countries, and there is something to be said for having global multilateral system. It's not evenly, power is not evenly distributed, but to have agencies, we talked about ICG in the previous panel, and, but to protect human rights and to protect humanity from a lot of the evil that we spoke about that is out there. And so I think it's about what is their role going forward in that. And then you said one more thing, but I forgot what it was, so I'm going to stop and I'll come back to it if I remember.
So for the second question, I just want to pick up on what you said, Alex. So there was a statistic that I saw on LinkedIn that at this UNGA, number 79, less than 10% of the speakers were women or people who identified as women. And that goes to the second question. So to Nadine and to Aarti, I'm going to ask you to address this. How does the humanitarian sector continue to do this? How is it still, the power dynamics are gender, sexuality, all these, all the different kinds of identities are not being taken, into account in terms of participation and inclusion. And also, I'm going to add a question for both of you to end on, is when we do think about the future, how do we make sure that we're not replicating those power imbalances? Nadine, you want to go first?
I could go first. First, I wanna thank the person from the audience, I did not recall the name, who talked about the ears and not only the voices to be heard. So that is true in a lot of instances. Now, the second thing about gender and about women and about the statistics that you mentioned, Lena, I think that the problem we're facing is mainly in the leadership, because the representation that could go to the UN General Assembly or to the speakers who would speak or talk are mainly the representation or the leadership. And this is where I believe that we as practitioners ought to be mentoring additional new faces to be there. And I could tell you that in Lebanon, it's a bit the reverse. And a lot of the local NGO, we see a lot of women being active. And I was really shocked to hear what you've said. The way we see it, the way we work on it is just to make sure that we have all across, from the outreach field perspective to the project management perspective, having a diversity within the organization. But other than this, it needs as well to be worked with the community. It needs as well to be streamlined in the different interventions. And this goes into very tangible things, from ensuring that you have daycare for the children, to ensuring that when you have young girls meeting in a group, in a committee with a local municipality leader, that you have a strong facilitator that gives them the opportunity to talk and talk freely. I'm going to take a bit of time here because I'm going to tell you a personal experience that happened with me. I was training a group of young people in one very rural area, even of Akkar. And then there was this young girl who started to speak about a real solution to the question I asked. And then she was interrupted. And then she stopped. And I was waiting to see, would she repeat? Would she say it louder? She did not. And they did not solve whatever we had to solve. And then I talked to her and I said, why didn't you repeat it? Why didn't you say it louder? And she's like, we're not used to speak loudly. And I think this is a habit that we have. And it's a habit in the collective memory of communities to have, and I speak here about girls because we work a lot with girls and women who are used to be put aside in crises. And usually whenever you have a crisis, their priorities, their needs just go to the lowest bench. So for me, it's a dual work. It's working within the organization, it's working within the community, and ensuring that we have a mentoring component, a coaching component to encourage others to, go into this ladder and reach managerial and leadership positions.
All right, you get the last word.
Okay. I think you said the multiplicity of identities that we all carry, right? I'm not going to just talk about the humanitarian sector because this is a aid sector issue. It's an aid sector issue. When you fill out your forms, it's still women and girls, men and boys. What about the plethora of other identities? And we don't even consider when people have multiple identities. You could be an Arab man and queer and a civilian journalist, who's a dear friend of mine, who wears all these identities and is doing advocacy work and has different types of stresses to his security as a result of that. No, we see the world in checkboxes. And when Nadine talked about this earlier as well, the tools we use, and I'm going to quote from bell hooks, the tools that we use represent the patriarchal racist structures that we come from. When we reduce people to tick boxes, we do aid by tick boxes, right? The actual analysis, the thought, is this right to do? What harms could happen if I do this? We've reduced it to tick boxes because of risk aversion, because of accountability. Hey, you want to go do a community engagement and accountability program? Here's a form and make sure it's all filled out, and then we submit it to the system. We reduce our identities to tick boxes, all of us. And when we do that, we don't imagine that the way we live, let's say here in New York City, and the multiple identities I can carry and switch between very easily, that's not the same to people, societies over there. Black and brown bodies don't have those same freedoms or that ways of living, and that's a fundamental untruth. When we don't see things in the truth in which it exists, which our tick boxes checklists do not allow us to, then we reduce it to boxes that fulfill our capitalist, patriarchal, gendered, narcissistic ideas of how the world should work. So I'll finish with a quote from bell hooks, because I love bell hooks. Are we merely maintaining the oppressive system? And I'm completely butchering this, but are we fundamentally maintaining the systems of oppression and butchery of the racist patriarchy that we are continuing to uphold by continuing to have these same practices, these same tools, do we need, if we are talking about reimagination, then we need to reimagine everything, and not just in ways that uphold the systems that are doing injustice for all of us. That's it. Thank you.
I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank all of you. I realize that we have sort of overshot our time, but thank you very much for staying with us. I'll finish up by saying that Jeremy in the last panel had talked about the battle over narrative. The work that I do is all about narrative power. It is how narrative power, how the narratives of communities and the people who are most affected by the issues that we're dealing with is a catalyst for transformation towards justice and equity in different futures. And I think every single one of our speakers today have demonstrated what narrative power can do, just the stories and the experiences that you all have brought. I want to thank you very much. And I'm the other 3.5 hours of topics, I'm going to come back to you. And we're going to do another session. Please, there's a QR code here. Please, you can find the New Humanitarians Rethinking Humanitarian podcast through that. We are going to be doing a podcast called Power Shift that you all have been a little bit of a part of. So that will be coming out in a few months, all about shifting power. So thank you very much, Refugees International, the New Humanitarian. Thank you to all of you, and thank you most of all to all of you. Thank you, Nadine.